World War II produced countless monsters, but there is no one like this Japanese general. On the remote island of Chichijima, he unleashed horrors so unspeakable that even hardened soldiers could barely comprehend them. Captured American pilots entered his camps as prisoners, but gradually his brutal methods turned them into victims, broken under the weight of unimaginable torment. What kind of man commits crimes so dark that they're almost impossible to believe and even harder to stomach? Japanese Lieutenant General Yoshio Tachibana, the commander of the 25,000-man garrison, presided over a kingdom of despair. With his supply lines cut and his men sentenced to certain death, he unleashed a reign of terror that forever marked his name in the darkest history of wartime atrocity. This is the story of the man they called the Ghost of Chichijima, and the day American pilots stopped being prisoners of war and became prey. Lieutenant General Yoshio Tachibana conducted systematic rituals of cannibalism. His orders made monsters of men. He commanded his officers to execute prisoners, dismember them, and consume their flesh. This wasn't about survival. It was a ritual to boost their courage. The most prized parts of the victims were their internal organs, referred to by the code word chemo. This word meant liver, but it also meant courage, spirit, and life force. Life on the island was cruel for everyone, including the Japanese soldiers. Their Bushido training had been warped into a deadly ideology that celebrated death. To grasp the horror of the most terrifying man of World War II, we must first explore the island he ruled, the island fortress of despair. By late 1944, the Pacific War had decisively turned against Japan. The American war machine, a vast force of industry and military power, was island-hopping across the Pacific, inching ever closer to the Japanese mainland. In this high-stakes campaign, even the smallest islands became fortresses, either sacrificed to buy time or defended at all costs. Chichijima, part of the same Ogasawara island chain as the infamous blood-soaked Iwo Jima, was one of these critical prizes. Forget its size. In 1945, the tiny rock of Chichijima was Japan's electronic fortress. Its powerful radio stations were a dagger in the side of the American war effort, intercepting fleet movements and B-29 raid timings. For the U.S. to conquer Iwo Jima, the nerve center on Chichijima had to be severed. The Japanese high command was all too aware of this. They understood that Chichijima, the father island, was a dagger aimed at the heart of their naval communications, and they fortified it strongly. The island was transformed into a formidable fortress. Chichijima's volcanic rock was carved into caves, bunkers, and tunnels. Anti-aircraft guns, coastal batteries, and machine gun nests covered every angle. Defending it were 25,000 soldiers. That was 3,000 more than Iwo Jima. One Marine veteran later said it best: Iwo was hell, Chichi would have been impossible. By 1945, this fortress had become a tomb. A U.S. Navy noose had choked off all supplies. Rations were slashed. Amputations were done in unsterile caves where maggots crawled from fresh wounds. The men were cornered, abandoned by leadership, and ordered to embrace a shattered jewel death. Presiding over this desperate, isolated, and increasingly hopeless kingdom of 25,000 trapped men was the island's supreme commander, Lieutenant General Yoshio Tachibana. He was not a man who inspired with grand speeches or fatherly affection. He was a hard, ruthless, and deeply feared commander who ruled through an iron-fisted interpretation of military discipline. As the American blockade tightened, as the bombs began to fall, and as the sheer hopelessness of their situation became undeniable, Tachibana's command descended into a unique and horrifying form of collective madness, the forging of a monster in the cult of death. Before he was the ghostly commander of a cannibal island, who was Yoshio Tachibana, and what system created him? The man who would become the Ghost of Chichijima was not born into Japan's aristocratic samurai class. His career was forged in the crucible of China, where the Imperial Army was perfecting its infamous three-alls policy: Sanko Sakusen, kill all, loot all, burn all. Tachibana wasn't just a product of this unparalleled brutality. He was a man who relished it. To understand him, we must understand the system that shaped him. By the 1940s, the image of the samurai was dead. Japan's ultra-nationalist leaders had weaponized Bushido into a fanatical cult of death. The army was no longer a class of warriors. It was made up of poor farm boys dismissed as isengoren, meaning 1 yen 50 sen, the cost of a postcard home. As these young recruits arrived at the boot camp, they entered what one survivor described as a brutal gulag of horrors. They were systematically broken down, and every shred of individuality and compassion was erased through constant, savage beatings. One soldier, Shinji Ito, recalled being beaten so badly his face was permanently disfigured. During swim training, he was repeatedly thrown into a freezing river with a rope tied to him until he passed out, only to be revived and thrown back in again and again. This physical torture was paired with intense psychological indoctrination. The twisted code of Bushido became a cult of death. Soldiers were taught their highest honor was to die for the emperor, a living god. Surrender was the ultimate disgrace, and blind, unthinking obedience was the only virtue. As author James Bradley notes, no army in history so systematically instilled hatred in its troops. They were forged into non-human weapons, and their humanity was extinguished so they would feel nothing, extinguishing the humanity of others. Yoshio Tachibana was a graduate and a master of this brutal system. The cannibalism on Chichijima wasn't a secret act of starving soldiers. It was a leadership decision made by General Tachibana at a dinner party. That was the kind of man who presided over the island fortress of despair, a commander forged in the brutality of China, leading an army of dehumanized soldiers, all trapped and facing their own certain death. This volatile and explosive combination of a sadistic leader, a brutalized garrison, and a hopeless situation created a powder keg on Chichijima. All it needed was a spark, and that spark was about to fall from the sky. The prey falls into his kingdom. For the thousands of men trapped on Chichijima, the enemy wasn't a distant threat. It was a daily terror that screamed from the sky. And for General Tachibana, the arrival of these flying enemies presented a dark and twisted opportunity. The attackers were the American flyboys, the knights of the modern age. They were young, boys barely out of their teens, flying powerful Grumman Avengers and Corsairs often named after their sweethearts back home. These pilots knew every mission could be their last. One 19-year-old gunner, Grady York, ended his final letter home with a simple, haunting plea: "Pray for me." He could never have imagined what he would truly need to be saved from. Between February 18th and 23rd, 1945, these flyboys launched a series of relentless bombing raids against Tachibana's fortress. Their target was the critical radio installations that were his eyes and ears. Tachibana's defenses were lethal. His gunners responded by filling the sky with anti-aircraft fire. One after another, U.S. aircraft were ripped from the sky. 8 airmen escaped the burning wrecks, but Japanese patrols caught them and brought them ashore to Tachibana's island. Their names were Marv Mershon, Jimmy Dye, Grady York, Floyd Hall, Warren Earl Vaughn, Lloyd Wilhoff, Warren Hinnenlang, and Glenn Fraser Jr. The war was over for them, but their ordeal was just beginning. The captured men were immediately subjected to the fury of Tachibana's soldiers. They were bound, beaten, and, in some cases, tied to trees for days to be used as punching bags. For General Tachibana, the capture of these 8 men was more than a military victory. It was an opportunity to solve the problem of his garrison's plummeting morale. He needed a spectacle to reassert his absolute authority. The first ritual sacrifice was ordered. The youngest prisoner, 19-year-old radio man Marv Mershon, was chosen. He was taken to a freshly dug pit, forced to his knees, and, in a formal ceremony, beheaded by a single sword stroke. This war crime alone was a brutal statement, but it was only the prelude. The true catalyst for the horror to come occurred on February 24th, when General Tachibana met with one of his most feared subordinates, Major Sueo Matoba. Major Matoba was a notorious alcoholic, and when General Tachibana arrived, he found the major at the end of a 3-day sake bender. As the 2 men continued to drink heavily, their conversation turned to the almost mythical stories of the 150,000 Japanese troops in New Guinea who had survived by local provisioning, the coded term for cannibalism. According to a terrified witness at the post-war trials, Tachibana and Matoba spoke of these events not with horror, but with a perverse admiration. It was in this drunken, depraved state of mind that the fate of the remaining American prisoners was sealed. The General's Banquet. Later that same afternoon, on February 24th, 1945, General Tachibana and Major Matoba were invited to the quarters of another officer, Colonel Kato, for a meal of sukiyaki. The air was damp and suffocating. It carried the stench of sake and the tension of men who knew the war was lost. These gatherings gave the men a brief escape. For a moment, they could pretend to have a normal life on an island of despair. But with Tachibana present, that illusion was fragile. It could shatter at any moment. As the highest-ranking officer on Chichijima, his presence demanded absolute respect. He wasn't a guest. He was a ruler in his court, and his mood set the tone for everyone around him. When the dish of thinly sliced meat and vegetables was served, the illusion of order broke. As Tachibana stared at the small portion of meat, his voice cut through the room. He complained loudly that there wasn't enough to feed all the officers. It seemed like a minor complaint, but from his mouth it carried the weight of a threat. The host froze. His subordinate, Major Matoba, already deep in a drunken stupor, erupted in a loud theatrical fury over the supposed insult. The room scrambled with stammered apologies. They explained that meat was the most tightly rationed commodity on the blockaded island, and they were already stretching it as far as they could. For any other commander, the issue would have died there. An angry remark, a few apologies, and the dinner would go on. But Yoshio Tachibana was no ordinary commander. In that moment of perceived scarcity and drunken anger, the dark seed planted in his earlier conversation with Matoba began to sprout. According to the testimony of those who were there, a strange look came over the general's face. It was a moment of what he considered divine, almost spiritual inspiration. He turned his gaze from the food to the fuming Major Matoba. His voice, now laced with a dark and deliberate authority, broke the tense silence. He asked Matoba about the execution and getting some meat. The room felt dead quiet. The implication was immediate, monstrous, and undeniable. Tachibana was not talking about their ration stores. He was talking about the body of 19-year-old Marv Mershon, the American radio man shot that very day and shoved into a shallow grave by the cemetery. Tachibana was proposing a solution to his dinner party problem that was so far beyond human decency. His request defied comprehension. He was proposing cannibalism, not as an act of survival, but as a catering choice. To ensure no one misunderstood his intent, he then addressed the entire room of stunned officers. He declared that one had to have enough fighting spirit to eat human flesh. This was the masterstroke of his depravity. He was framing this atrocity not as a crime, but as a virtue. It was a test of their loyalty, their warrior spirit, and their commitment to the twisted ideology he ruled by. He was turning a primal taboo into a rite of passage. And then he used the word chemo. When General Tachibana spoke of eating the Americans' chemo, he was invoking a concept that resonated deep within the Japanese psyche. On a literal level, chemo means liver, but its cultural and spiritual meaning is far more profound. Chemo is the seat of one's courage, one's spirit, one's guts, the very essence of a person's life force. Acting on the direct inspiration of his general, Major Matoba seized the moment. Around 4:30 in the afternoon, he summoned his captain and gave him the direct and horrifying order: go to the cemetery, dig up the American, and cut the chemo from his body. The horrified captain tried to protest. This was an order beyond any conceivable military duty. But Matoba, empowered by Tachibana and his own drunken fury, would not be denied. The terrified captain had no choice but to obey. He enlisted the battalion surgeon, reasoning that a medical man would at least know how to perform the gruesome task with some semblance of precision. Immediately, a small party of soldiers was dispatched to the makeshift cemetery. Under the fading orange light of a Pacific sunset, they exhumed Marv Mershon's body. Then the surgeon cut open the young American's corpse and removed his liver and a significant piece of flesh from his thigh. The meat was wrapped and brought back to the officers' party. The atmosphere was no longer festive. It was thick with a silent, suffocating dread. The human flesh was taken to the kitchens, where it was cooked in soy sauce and vegetables and then brought out, ready to be served. This was the moment of truth for every junior officer present. They were faced with an order, sanctioned by the highest authority on the island, that defied their own humanity. To refuse was an act of insubordination against a terrifying commander, punishable by a severe beating or worse. To obey was to become a monster. In a brilliant and subtle act of mass defiance, most of them found a third option. They did not refuse the plate when it was offered. Instead, one by one, they claimed to be unworthy of participating in such a spiritual ritual. It was their way of declining the meal without directly challenging their superiors. But their commanders had no such reservations. General Tachibana, the architect of this entire depravity, and his willing accomplice, Major Matoba, ate their portions. The taboo was broken. The psychological line from which there was no return had been crossed, not by desperate, starving soldiers, but by the island's supreme commander as the solution to a dinner party complaint. Their profane meal was only interrupted by the blare of an American air raid siren, accompanied by screams from the sky that seemed to be a judgment on the hell they had just unleashed on the ground. The true horror of what General Tachibana had initiated was not in its chaotic, drunken origin, but in how quickly it became cold, calculated, and bureaucratic. This was not a one-time act of madness, it became policy. Among the records found after the war was an order from Major Matoba, issued on March 9, 1945. The battalion intends to consume the flesh of the American aviator, Lieutenant Hall. First Lieutenant Tomari is tasked with overseeing the rationing of this flesh. Cadet Sakabe is assigned to attend the execution and remove the liver and gallbladder. This document is one of the evils that General Tachibana had unleashed. It transformed an act of primal savagery into a routine military order. Rationing and assigned are words of logistics, not passion. They reveal how Tachibana's initial depraved inspiration had successfully permeated the command structure. A war crime became an administrative task. The madness was now organized. The General's Symphony of Savagery. With the taste of human flesh now on their palates, did the madness of the island's commander stop, or did it spiral even further out of control? The remaining American airmen were no longer prisoners. They were a store of flesh and chemo for future feasts. Their lives hung on the whims of the island's high command. A few days after the first incident, the order was given for the next victim. Grady York, the 19-year-old gunner who had asked his family to pray for him. He was untied from the tree where he had been beaten and was marched to a clearing. There, he was tied to a telephone pole. Tachibana understood the power of ritualized vengeance, so he selected a group of soldiers whose comrades had been killed in the recent American bombing raids to serve as the execution squad. This was a deliberate act of psychological manipulation, as he turned their grief and rage into a tool of depravity. They were not given rifles for a quick, impersonal death. They were handed sharpened bamboo spears and bayonets. According to the horrified testimony of onlookers, the soldiers slowly and methodically pierced Grady York to death. It was a slow, agonizing, and intimate act of murder designed to be as traumatic for the perpetrators as it was for the victim. And through it all, in an act of almost superhuman defiance, survivors testified that Grady York did not cry out or make a single sound as he was killed. Next was Jimmy Dye. His case was even more bizarre. It was a perfect illustration of the cold, utilitarian cruelty that defined Tachibana's island. Dye was temporarily spared because he had some knowledge of radio operations, making him useful as a potential interpreter. He was assigned to a Japanese translator who, in a shocking and dangerous act of compassion, defied the spirit of Tachibana's rule and actually befriended the young American, even though he knew what fate eventually awaited Jimmy. When the order finally came down from the high command that Dye was no longer useful, the translator performed one last, tragic act of kindness. Tasked with leading Jimmy to his death, he lied, telling him they were just going to parade him in front of the men as a show of force. He did this, as he later testified, to spare the young man the abject terror of knowing what was about to happen. Jimmy was taken to a freshly dug hole and forced to kneel at its edge. This time, the execution was to be performed by officers with their swords. But these were not skilled samurai of old. They were clumsy, likely drunken butchers. It took 3 different officers hacking away at his neck to finally kill him. Afterwards, according to the standard procedure established by Tachibana's first feast, the unit's doctor was ordered to remove Jimmy's liver. The doctor, visibly shaken and pale after the dissection, looked up at his superior officer with his voice trembling and asked, "I think that is enough. I don't want to cut anymore. Do you think that is enough?" His plea was ignored. Later that night, Jimmy's liver was served at another of Captain Yoshi's drunken officers' parties. The madness was spreading through the command chain. In the midst of this relentless, systematic savagery, a strange and surreal pocket of humanity managed to exist. 2 of the remaining pilots, Warren Earl Vaughn and Floyd Hall, were kept alive for several weeks. They were placed under the care of an intelligence officer named Major Horry. Horry was a different kind of man. He was not a sadist or a drunk. He was an educated man fascinated by American culture, and he saw his 2 prisoners not as objects but as human beings. Under Horry's protection, they were untied, fed from the officers' own rations, and for once, no blows fell upon them. A genuine, unlikely friendship began to form in this corner of hell. Horry began taking daily English lessons from them. They in turn learned some broken Japanese. They taught him, in his own words, how to enter a nightclub, order drinks, and how to snuggle a honey on the dance floor. They attended parties with their captors, drinking sake and joking with the Japanese soldiers. For Vaughn and Hall, it must have been a bizarre dream, a glimmer of hope that they might somehow survive. But their friendship with a mid-level officer was a flickering candle in the hurricane of General Tachibana's command. Humanity was an act of rebellion on Chichijima, and it would not be tolerated. When the time came, the orders came down from the ultimate authority on the island. Both men were to be executed. Major Horry pleaded for a humane death for his unlikely friends, but his pleas were useless against the depraved appetites of his superiors. Floyd Hall, who had been laughing and joking with his guards just moments before, was taken to the execution ground. He was made to kneel, given a last glass of whiskey and a cigarette, blindfolded, and then beheaded. His liver and a portion of his thigh meat were immediately removed and taken for a feast for the high-ranking officers that night. The brief interlude of humanity was brutally extinguished by the unyielding savagery that flowed from the top of the command chain. 8 of the captured American airmen had been tortured, executed, and, in 5 of the cases, cannibalized in a series of horrific rituals personally instigated and sanctioned by General Yoshio Tachibana. He had successfully transformed his island fortress into a butcher shop and his officer corps into a cannibal cult. The official records were clear. 9 airmen had been shot down, but only 8 were accounted for on the island. A 9th flyer had also been shot down on the same mission. But he was not among the dead. Who was he, and how in the world did he escape a fate that completely consumed his comrades? The Ghost's Reckoning. That 9th man was a 20-year-old pilot whose bomber was shot down on the September 2nd, 1944. He bailed out into the vast Pacific, injured and terrified, only 4 miles from Tachibana's island fortress. As he clung to a small life raft, the currents began to pull him toward the shore. He could see Japanese patrol boats launching from the beach, coming for him. He paddled with his bare hands against the tide and the hunters from Chichijima. He was moments from being captured when a shape broke the surface of the water. It was the periscope of the American submarine, the USS Finback. By an almost unbelievable miracle of timing and luck, he was pulled from the water and he escaped the jaws of the island by the slimmest of margins. That 20-year-old pilot, the one man who escaped the fate General Tachibana had planned for all downed airmen, was a young lieutenant named George Herbert Walker Bush. He went on to become the 41st President of the United States. For over 50 years, he remained unaware of the horrific truth of what he had actually escaped. It was not just a prison camp. He had, by a hair's breadth, escaped being the main course at a banquet hosted by the Ghost of Chichijima. In September of 1945, when the war finally ended and the full might of American justice turned its attention to the Pacific, the man who had turned an island into his personal butcher shop could no longer hide. When U.S. forces landed on Chichijima to accept the surrender of the garrison, General Yoshio Tachibana, the absolute ruler of his island kingdom, formally surrendered his sword aboard an American warship. Stripped of his authority, he was once again just a man. But when the American officers immediately asked about the fate of the 9 U.S. Navy pilots known to have been captured, Tachibana and his staff enacted one final, audacious act of defiance. Through his chief of staff, Yoshitaka Hori, a carefully rehearsed lie was delivered with a straight face. He claimed that all the prisoners had been tragically killed during an American bombing raid that hit their shelter. To sell the story beyond doubt, Tachibana had his men create a set of fake graves. He then issued a strict gag order to all 25,000 soldiers in his former garrison. Speak of what truly happened, and you will face the consequences. For a short time, it seemed that the ghost's final act would be to erase his own crimes from history. But the cover-up was too neat and the story was too convenient. U.S. military investigators got deeply suspicious. They dispatched intelligence teams to mainland Japan to intercept the returning soldiers from the Chichijima garrison. Away from the menacing presence of General Tachibana and his loyal officers, under intense questioning, the wall of silence he had built began to crack. Horrific, unbelievable stories began to trickle out. Stories of torture, of beheadings, and of ritual cannibalism, all pointing to the top. In February 1946, the hunt for the perpetrators began. U.S. military police rounded up the suspects. Finally, they came for the ghost himself. General Yoshio Tachibana, the man who had ruled through absolute fear, was arrested along with his chief accomplice, Major Sueyo Matoba. They were deported to the U.S. territory of Guam, not as commanders, but as prisoners, to stand trial for war crimes. The trial of General Tachibana was a shocking spectacle. The American prosecution team laid out the chilling details of his reign, painting a picture of a commander who had been in total control of the atrocities. The testimony from the Japanese soldiers who had been forced to witness the events was damning. They spoke of the drunken dinner party, of Tachibana's direct orders, of his perverse warrior spirit speeches. The prosecution, however, faced a unique legal problem that spoke to the unique nature of Tachibana's evil. At the time, the act of cannibalism, as morally repugnant as it was not specifically listed as a war crime under international law. His depravity was literally off the books. Therefore, the defendants were formally charged with murder and, in a chillingly bureaucratic phrase, prevention of honorable burial. In the end, the evidence was overwhelming. The court found that General Tachibana was not just a participant, but the prime architect of the horrors. He, Major Matoba, Captain Yoshi, and 2 other senior officers were found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging. Several other junior officers received lengthy prison sentences. In September of 1947, Yoshio Tachibana was executed on Guam and buried in an unmarked grave. But the story of his evil has one final dark chapter. The details of the Chichijima incident were so gruesome and so profoundly disturbing that the U.S. government made an extraordinary decision. When the mothers of the murdered airmen began to hear the dark rumors, they petitioned the government, begging them to stop the full story from ever becoming public. As one grieving mother wrote, "I thought our children died honorably. I never imagined that they would be eaten in such a horrible way. Please stop this report." In an act of compassion, the military agreed. The crimes of General Tachibana were deemed too horrific for the families and the American public to know. The full records were sealed and classified. His actions were so uniquely depraved and so far beyond the accepted horrors of war that his legacy was officially buried for more than 50 years.